Would you pray with me? Now, O Lord, grant that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts might be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. For the meditation this morning, I want to share with you a story. It is basically a story that Barbara Brown Taylor tells. I shared a piece of this last night at 8 and 11 in a sermon entitled God's Daring Plan, but she frames it as a story, and it's wonderfully told, and I thought, what's better than a story on Christmas morning? So here it goes. Once upon a time, or actually before there was time, before there were clocks and calendars and Christmas trees, God was all there was. We don't know anything about that time because there wasn't anyone to tell us about it. But somewhere in the middle of that time, before time, God decided to make a world. And no one knows why. Perhaps God was bored, or maybe God was lonely, or maybe God just liked to make things and decided it was time to make something really big. And so God made a world, this world. And God filled it with all kinds of wondrous things, with mountains and trees, with humpback whales that sing and white-tailed skunks that stink, and birds made up of more colors than a box of Crayola crayons. The list is too long to go on with, but God looked back at that world and saw that it was good, it was grand, it was beautiful. But something was missing. It was kind of like a painting without a signature. And so God decided to start working on a signature piece. Something that was in God's own image. Something that others would see and know God made all this. And God started to make just one signature piece, but then God knew what it was to be alone and knew what it was like to have company, and it was a lot better to have company. And so God made two things instead of one. They were like each other, but they were different, a man and a woman, to keep each other company. And when God sat back and looked at the creation with Adam and Eve, he saw it was very good. Now, it wasn't long before God was just head over heels in love with them. They loved being together. God loved going on walks with them in the cool of the evening, which is why it broke God's heart when behind his back they decided to do the one thing God had asked them not to do. And everything was different after that. They hid from God. From God. Now, God loved them as much as always, but the feeling, well, it wasn't mutual. Birds were crazy about God. They sang to God every morning. And dolphins, too, with their little songs, singing to God. They just couldn't get enough of God jumping up in the water, doing somersaults. But human beings, not so much. They were very busy making things, growing things, selling things, buying things. God would come to the window at night and throw a pebble. Come out, let's go for a walk. No, we're much too busy for that, God. And before long, human beings, most of them at least, they just forgot all about God. They started calling themselves self-made men and self-made women, as if that was a good thing. There were some who still believed they would draw pictures of God, but the pictures looked just like them. And that made it a whole lot easier for them to turn away from people who didn't look like them, people who were different. And you would not believe the trouble this got them into. Wars, cities split in two right down the middle, one kind on one side, another kind on the other. And God tried everything to get their attention. God tried floods, famines. God sent messengers. God sent manna. God got inside people's dreams. And when they didn't pay attention to that, God would wake them up and whisper to them in the night. But no matter what, nothing worked. It was like they couldn't even understand God. God would cry out, "Please stop destroying yourselves." And all they would hear was thunder. God would cry out, "I love you as much as the day I made you." And all they would hear was a loon calling across the lake. Now, babies were the one exception to this. Babies couldn't get enough of God, and babies didn't have any trouble hearing God. They were always laughing at God's jokes or crying when God cried. Now, all this went right over the parents' heads. Colic, they'd say. Dust mites. But the babies knew, because God had told them, that it was cleaning day in heaven, and the angels were shaking the stars from their feather dusters. Babies, they never went to war. Babies never made hate speeches or littered or refused to play with each other because they were members of different political parties. Babies knew that they depended on other people. The phrase, self-made babies, well, that just made them laugh until their bellies hurt. And that gave God a great idea. Why not create himself as one of these delightful creatures, a baby? Well, God shared the idea with all the archangels, and it was very quiet. Not the kind of good quiet, but bad quiet. And one of the archangels came forward and said, "You know, God, we would worry about you. You're putting yourself at the mercy of your creatures. People, well, they could do anything to you. And there'd be no escape if things turned south." One of the angels suggested that God be a magic baby, just with some special powers. It wouldn't take much. Maybe the power to become invisible if things got hard, or maybe to hurl a lightning bolt every now and then if you needed to. But God said no. And they tried to press God more and more. "It's a great idea, God. It lacks adequate safety features." God thanked them for their concern, but said, "No, I think I'll just be a regular baby. How else can I gain the trust of my creatures? How else can I persuade them that I know their lives inside and out, unless I take on a life like theirs?" And God knew there was a risk, a high risk, but that's part of what God wanted them to know. That he was willing to risk everything just to get close to them, in hopes that they might love God again. Well, when the angels saw that God was dead set on this whole baby thing, they started to clap. Not the kind of raucous applause that you see at a football game, unless it's the Panthers game. Not much reason to applaud. But you know the clap I'm talking about, slow clap. Just clapping. And while they were still clapping, God turned around and left the cabinet chamber up there in heaven, and his midnight blue mantle fell to the floor. And right in the spot that it fell, the floor melted away, and a hole opened up to reveal a scrubby patch of brown pasture and some shepherds sitting around a fire drinking wine from a skin. Well, let me tell you, when that hole opened up, they were sore afraid. And one of the angels peeked her head over that hole, saw the shepherds looking up at her, and she said in as gentle a voice as possible, "Don't be afraid. For see, I bring you glad tidings of great joy for all the people." And away up the hill in the direction of town came the sound of a newborn baby's cry. Merry Christmas to you all.